Hello, this is Charles Tassell, Chief Operating Officer for the National Real Estate Investor Association, with an update, a little bit of a kind of a reflection summary of our legislative update from the mid-year conference. I want to encapsulate it here for everyone, give a nice summary of it. So with that, let me touch on this. And I couldn't resist this legislative good news. These are satellites looking for it because it's been just brutal for a little while here. So with that, we're going to scroll down through some of these and see what we can come to. Starting with a variety of things. Folks, we got interest rates going through the roof. I should say inflation going through the roof. Interest rates are starting to climb. In fact, small jumps have led to large increases in mortgage rates. Not really a parity there, just an expansion in spreads. But we're also seeing a variety of things from impacts, secondary and third level reactions and causal effects from the Russia-Ukraine incident, post-COVID logistics issue, all of that. So that's really where we're at, including in the lower corner, you'll see these are street damaging, street fighting, street issues. People erupting in the streets. Upper left is a strike from truckers. We're seeing farm strikes. We're seeing a variety of different kinds of issues going on around the world, and it's only going to get more intense for a little while. So with that in mind, let's look at really where we're at. Couldn't resist sharing this. Not the most optimistic picture, but this is one of the things that's, who's knocking at the door right now. We've had highs in the sales volumes, highs in the sales prices. If you wanted to sell, that window may be closing somewhat, although we may see more of a plateau on some of the real estate prices rather than just necessarily a full drop. But there may be a drop coming because of demographics and bigger issues behind the scenes. So with that in mind, somebody may be knocking at the door and careful answering that. So with that in mind, I want to touch on one thing real quick. And this is when we talk about interest rates going up and people start to panic about, oh my word, the housing market's going to tank. If we look at a couple things, these were interest rates in the 80s. Oh my word, credit card level rates. But if we come back over here and look at what it did to housing and median sale price, you can see there really wasn't that much of an impact. Now, it slowed it, but it just continued on. So the correlation between here and potentially where we're going into with higher interest rates, it may be a different kind of slowdown. And depending on the demographics of, there's some pent up demand of people who weren't able to get into the market because, they were the third, fourth, fifth person to respond to a bid, or they got there after the 4-hour sweet spot. I mean, that's some of the ridiculous timeframes that we've seen. As some of that slows and cools, we get back to a more normal process. There will still be some pent up demand for single family homes. And that also means probably still buying some of the foreclosed properties or buying some of the other properties that are out there that are in need of help, which for a while, most millennials had really shied away from. We saw millennials, they wanted to see something that was completed and finished and weren't really buying those until the market got so hot and so tight that they couldn't buy anything else. And then they started working on fixing up their own. So that put more pressure onto rehabbers and folks in our industry who are looking to either reposition or recapitalize a property entirely. So with that in mind, I want to think about in terms of the legislative impact because of these things. The first one is something we've been dealing with before COVID, but has now become literally front page fodder. Housing affordability. What does affordability mean? We've addressed that from what's obtainable housing to how do we even pitch what's really affordable and understand it, because that term has so many connotations to it beyond anything we really want to balance out. And We can look at from Cincinnati area where I'm from, 960 range, to seeing, Vegas, one of those ones that does the climb and drop and up and down. We've seen some of that, and we're seeing the peaks and the pressure on it now after the 2008, 9, 10, and some would even say 11, 12 bottoms. But pressure coming up to, we're not talking about something that's absolutely ridiculous like a San Francisco price or a New York price. So part of that, though, is what we have to do as real estate investors is really address some of the myths when people, whether it's people, reporters, Joe on the street, family members who have these myths out there that are spouted and then are picked up by politicians who must do something. So therefore they try to pass a bill. And let's address a couple of these. One is people don't rent to somebody who's going to spend more than 50% of their monthly budget on housing. We don't do that. It's typically in the 30% range. If you really want to stretch, you go up to 30, 32%. But if the person doesn't have the ability to purchase food, clothes, medicine, all the other things, we all know all that is an eviction waiting to happen, and you're buying a headache. So that's a myth that's out there, that people are spending this much on their housing. Next one is evictions are profitable. That the complete farce of that idea cannot be laughed at and scoffed at enough, but it was good enough to generate a book and make somebody some money. So we'll leave it at that. But that is not the case. That is the most expensive part of and actually one of the things that can take under and take down a small business that's just starting because of the cost of it. It's a huge capital cost. Additionally, investors are buying up all housing. There's a real focus. There was a Senate hearing in February on this issue. There was a House hearing on this issue in June. There is ongoing concern about this in many municipalities. It's become kind of in vogue to write about investors buying it up. And part of what they're talking about is, not part of, they're really focused on corporate investors, institutional funding that has come in. And this is really not a surprise. This is something that back in 2014, 15, and even 16, The Economist was writing about this and how institutions were going to be betting on the best investment in the world, and the most stable investment in the world has actually been the U.S. housing market. Everything else can fall apart, go to zero. The U.S. housing market does not. And so institutional investing to the tune of billions upon billions has been rolling in to the housing market. And that is a very different factor than local investors like us buying and getting involved with our communities and really taking personal responsibility for these things. So that's one that dealing with what does it mean, say investors are buying up all housing. What does it really mean? It really means corporate housing or corporate investment, institutional dollars, and trying to address that. The last one that the landlords screen out good people. If you're not screening out and you're not, there's federal laws and fair housing issues that everybody complies with. If you are not complying with that, go get your fair housing training. Make sure you are complying with every aspect of it. First of all, we want to be good stewards and making sure we're not screening out good people. But we also need the ability to screen to find out if there are risk issues out there. The more risky that housing is forced to be, the fewer people are going to be involved in it, which means there's less supply, which means housing costs are going to go up. So municipalities need to be able to work with landlords, property owners, housing providers in order to do some sort of balance and create a balance there on how to balance who's coming in. Because from a local elected official perspective, do you want, axe murderers moving into your neighborhood, or do you want somebody who's going to trash the place and create all kinds of calls for police and fire and ambulance and just nothing but an absolute nuisance? Or do you want the local property owners to be able to screen out those kind of people? That's what we need to be able to do. And finding out, from previous evictions to what their records are is very important. And I will mention this, an arrest record does not count. We are innocent until proven guilty in this country, at least unless you're dealing with the IRS, but you are innocent until proven guilty. And that still holds true. And we need to make sure that, and just reiterate the fact that arrest records are not considered when we are looking at background checks. But these myths generate these lists of problems here. And these are problems that we're seeing across the country, and things that, do not help in housing and actually are the opposite, have the opposite effect, because that all they do is put more restrictions, more regulation on, and end up limiting who's going to invest in the area. And you end up with less housing and more costly housing rather than more affordable housing. So with that in mind, elections are coming. Elections are always coming in one sense, but there's some things that people are going to be looking at. A lot of people will look at how much am I doing better off than I was last time? And that's a whole throw the bums out, whoever's in charge, if I'm not doing better. Well, with gas prices, with inflation, a lot of people are saying, nope, throw the bums out, and we're going to start over. With that, typically polling will show that, crime taxes in schools are really your top issues. Whenever there's any kind of polling done about locally what's going on, but there's one thing that can override that absolutely, and that's when somebody looks in their wallet and goes, oh my word, I just spent how much to fill up my car? I can't do this. Excuse me. I'm choking on that right there. Just, the cost of filling up my car. But this issue of how much, am I making more with my job or not? And is this a valuable proposition, or are things really rough? And right now things are looking rough, and the concern factors and the consumer confidence and the business owner confidence, entrepreneur confidence are at extreme lows. That's going to have an impact on the elections. Legislatively, folks, we've got a logjam. That's as simple as I can put it. That is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just, it is what it is. We do have flood insurance. It's working behind the scenes to get some Senate hearings. There needs to be a revamp of that program, and that's part of what they're trying to work on, actually in a bipartisan manner behind the scenes. So encourage that. As we get more information on that, I'll get that out. Affordable Home Ownership Access Act. Again, we work with our seller finance friends who are working on this issue, which will expand it from 3 in a rolling 12-month period to be able to actually sell your own property and finance it yourself. I know it's an amazing concept, but to be able to do more of that in this country. That will help with people who need to get into some of those houses that are typically in unbanked areas from either the urban core or into out in the rural areas. So with that in mind, we're going to continue working on HR 5013, and we're actually going to be doing a fly-in in September on that, probably around the 21st, 22nd. More information coming out on that. Eviction tracking bill. This is one that's been coming up, and it's been going for a little while. We're watching this. In part, I'm hoping that this is one of those bills that ends up shedding some light of reality, because every state uses the term eviction a little bit differently, and some groups want to use an eviction when somebody gives a 3-day notice as if that were an eviction. It's just not facts. So getting some consistent language on this would be very helpful. I do want to mention on there's Yes in My Backyard. Everybody's familiar with NIMBYs, Not in My Backyard. I don't want that around. This would remove some development limits, and actually the Fed is actually working on doing some of that. I'll say Fed, the administration through HUD is working on encouraging some of that as well. So that's a good one. Choice in affordable housing, which is HR 6880. Again, another bill that comes in. This is trying to streamline some of the process, make it better for working with your housing authorities, with Section 8, some of these different programs. These are the kinds of things that tend to sit in Congress for a couple of years, and then during that time, the administration will figure out which ones they actually want to do, and they'll start putting that in place, and eventually the law kind of codifies what they're actually doing already. But it gives, as more people, more congressmen sponsor and co-sponsor the bill, it kind of sends a message to the administration that maybe you need to consider doing these things. So that one's one that will keep putting pressure on the administration to streamline and make these programs better. The other one, this is an issue, is there's a privacy bill, and we've been working behind the scenes a little bit on this. And this is one that it has been all over the page. I'll put it that way, all over the table, all over everything, because it's gone from, you've got those who are not interested at all to those who want to use the California rules that are in place, which are very restrictive, as kind of a floor and make it more restrictive than that. So that's part of the concern. Do we use a California style? Do we use a European Union format? Where are we going? And that is starting to have conversations that are actually substantial behind the scenes to actually get to what may be some real solutions, but a little bit more business friendly than just what the California rules are. So we'll leave it at that for now. Really, the results of a logjam on the legislative side results in a fast track on the regulatory side. If I'm in the administration, I can't get my agenda through, well, doggone it, I'm going to go ahead and just move forward with my own regulations and start ramming them through. This is one where we're seeing it, and you can see the list of administration departments and such there that are moving these things forward. And this is one where I really encourage you to reach out to your local vendors. Rent Perfect spoke with us a little bit at mid-year, talking about this issue on background checks and how not only are there different issues and there's some tweaks that keep coming on the federal side, but there's also issues coming at the state side as well as the municipal side. And if you're operating in multiple municipalities, you need to make sure that there are not different rules for those municipalities. And if you're in different states, I can guarantee you there are different rules for those states and those different municipalities. So making sure you're tracking on that and staying up to date. Again, it's my fair housing push. Follow fair housing. Make sure you're locally in compliance with fair housing. And again, these kind of rules. So we are watching whether it's lead rules, regulations, new HUD updates. Testers are out in force. There was huge funds given out to testers to make sure that they're, to go through and functionally waste our time as housing providers, because you thought you had somebody who's interested in buying or renting a property, and no, they're not. They're just from the federal government here to help you. Yeah, thank you very much. So we are tracking this. We are actually adding regulatory tracking to our National RIA Action Center. This is information for you to follow, again, from several of these departments. As we're seeing issues crop up that are more of interest, we're trying to make sure we track that and send that along. There's been a lot of hullabaloo made about Build Back Better, and part of that kind of died on the vine initially, but one of the pieces that came back was a Build Back Better on the housing supply. And there's a couple of key pieces to it. One is, of course, legislative. We need money. Give us money, we'll do this, we'll do that, we'll do this, and all kinds of promises. Again, refer back to the logjam comment, probably not going to happen. But the regulatory side, they can do some things. And there's a couple of interesting points that were made. One is there's going to be some incentives. Again, whenever a municipality gets funds from the federal government, there's always strings attached. One of the strings will be an incentive for higher density, whether that's secondary domicile on a property, some sort of increased density based on per square acreage. Those are the kinds of things that they're going to be looking at for municipalities, and encouraging municipalities to allow for more density and more flexibility in the housing. The most interesting, though, is, and I couldn't resist putting this up here from a modular home perspective. I know the modular home folks are probably going to have a fit, but modular homes are what are talked about. A lot of us often refer to them as trailers, but one of the things that's interesting is the chattel loan. So if you are buying a trailer, you are not buying it through a mortgage typically. You actually will get a personal loan on it because it's not real estate. You're typically buying the actual trailer itself, or excuse me, the modular home itself. And a lot of those are typically, $20,000 to $50,000, okay, $20,000 to $30,000 loans. The problem is a personal loan is also much more expensive than all the benefits that come with a standard mortgage for real estate. So the White House has asked HUD, which has asked FHA, to figure out how to sponsor or cover chattel loans, these personal loans for modular homes and for trailers. What that will do is actually give people an opportunity, again, probably not in the coastal areas, but outside the coast, inside the rest of the flyover land here, an opportunity to actually buy into and get at better rates a trailer and start that track of individually buying their own home and having home ownership. So there is potential there. Again, this is at the level of instruction from the White House, instruction to HUD, instruction to FHA, and now the bureaucracy has to start its process of figuring out if it can do it, how it can do it, what's the best way to do it. But as more comes out on that, we'll let you know. At the state, we do use the example that status quo is often a good day. And really trying to balance what do you want to focus on, what's being brought forward, what are some of the hot issues. Again, rent control, preemption in 32 states, 8 states have rent control. Source of income is another issue. This is depending on the state and the municipality, what source of income actually means varies actually rather substantially. It can mean anything from limited to just a housing choice voucher, or it may exclude a housing choice voucher, or it may mean you have to do everything the housing choice voucher requires based on that local housing authority, or it may be more broad than that. So make sure if you've got source of income, the 9 states, 120 plus municipalities, and it's changing regularly, please make sure you're paying attention to that. There's other information that we are providing out from national on how to deal with some of the source of income, things to ask, questions to ask to make sure you're protecting yourself. We've seen electric vehicle ordinances, kind of ironic in the summer where we're seeing rolling brownouts because there's not enough electric for the air conditioners to run, but we're supposed to put in more electrical vehicle outlets at our properties. I don't know how this works, folks. Just reporting it at this point. So eviction controls, they're, especially with COVID, that ramped up with the preemptions and the shutdown and things, but we're now seeing other aspects of it, from bans on when you can be evicted to still seeing delays. Some people, California, sorry, you still got a long time before you're gonna be able to get into court, in part, and it's a planned process on their part. They're forcing that. Right to counsel is another issue, creating literally a legislative, or not legislative, a legal nightmare by throwing lawyers at you every time you try to evict someone and making the cost higher. And those are kinds of things that we're seeing across the country in a few key states. We're also seeing it more at the municipal level rather than at the necessarily at the full state level, but more at the municipal level. So with that, I mention this because the local level, and this is going to sound strange, but I'll say the bigger the pool you draw from, you often get kind of a cream of the crop. But that depends on how much pressure there is on it. Because in a lot of smaller municipalities, you'll get some of the better people stepping forward and running for local office. But at some point, you get a level of so much pressure, so much activists in there that they don't run for office. And when that happens, now you're not getting your best quality people, and you're getting people who will, lean more to this WKBTY, which is we know better than you, and we're going to tell you how to run your business, even though we may have never even run a business before, but we're going to tell you how to run your business because we know better than you. And that arrogance and pride, and some of it is just desperation because they have to do something and they have to act like they're in charge. So we see these security deposits, the background checks, all of this coming forward at the local levels as well. But we're seeing them at the state. And when we see them at the state, we had an example in New Orleans, for example, issue is brought in and people went, what in the world are they bringing this in? And a ban on wholesaling and a ban on this. And it got one hearing and it was dead. In part because a couple of the state representatives on that board that committee were actually doing wholesaling and participated in this. But it was a courtesy hearing. And I point this out because rather than getting torches and pitchforks going in there, we need to make sure we're really checking things out. Where do we need to really spend our time? Where do we really need to spend our influence? Because not everybody's against us. Not everybody's against business in general, but there are those out there who may have the courtesy of being allowed to speak to make sure everybody realizes, no, this is not what we want to do. And sometimes you need to let them speak for everybody else to kind of come around and go, oh, yeah, we don't want to do that. So, a couple of phone calls, your lobbyist can help you on these to find out, is this something that's really moving forward? Do we really need to spend time on it? And it depends on your area. Some areas are going to have traction faster than other areas, or there may be a different issue based on press releases, other issues going on. So keep that in mind. This is that difficulty. Red states and blue cities tend to put people purple in the face. Our gentleman here holding his breath. We know better than you. We're going to force you to do things. And this is where I get that kind of, how do we involve ourselves at the local level? I can tell you this, first and foremost, proactive engagement. It's talking with the Secretary of State in Kentucky one point. He made a comment. He said, 90% of politics is showing up. Just going to the different meetings, attending and being seen. As a council member, I can tell you having 3 to 4 people in the audience is very consistent. Those are the only 3 to 4. And we chat with them beforehand or after, and you got to know people. If 10 people showed up, we went, oh, there's a problem. And it's that way for legislators as well. But making sure we also provide positive policy feedback. Just saying no may feel good, but it really isn't bringing your critical expertise and as an expert in the industry to these local elected officials. Finally, I'm going to mention this, and people kind of cringe on this, but we are much more reluctant to get involved. But let me tell you something. Local municipalities are dying for people to be appointed to boards. I just had to fill out one the other day to get appointed to another local board. A lot of these boards are really not that time consuming, but they do take a little bit of half hour of reading materials before you get there, review, sit through a meeting, and make some decisions, whether they're zoning boards or boards of appeals, historic boards. All of these kind of things are very important. And when you're on that kind of a board, and then you come in to speak to the local legislators who put you on that board because of your expertise, and you tell them because of your expertise, you have very grave concerns about this issue or that issue, they're a lot more likely to listen to you because, this is a chairman said the other day, if you're not pulling the cart, I'm not listening to you. And that's how a lot of these elected officials get. They're like, if you're just throwing stones, I get people throwing stones all the time. But if you're actually helping to pull the cart and get things moving forward and working with me, and you have a concern, I'm very interested in hearing your concerns. So please look at boards and what it takes to get appointed to those boards. Most of the time, it really is just apply because they need people so badly. And folks, we've got expertise as local real estate investors on what's real and what's not. Finally, of course, you can always donate. That's always a good way to get in there. And I don't mean thousands upon thousands of dollars. $25, $35 events, $50 events, show up on a regular basis 2 to 3 times a year. people will get to know you pretty quickly. Those are very effective, and I'll just encourage you to be one of the first people there. That's one of the best ways to make sure you're involved. Finally, I come to this issue. I use the fishing example on the left. I was catching about a 6-foot black tip reef shark there, but that's not the kind of fishing I'm referring to. There's a lot of fishing going on right now with the issues going on between Russia, North Korea, China, and a little bit with Iran. There is a dramatically increased effort on scams coming into our country. I don't want your computer to bite you. I don't want your computer to shut down on you and you have to pay tons of money or whatever. Please make sure you're backing it up. And then also, phone used to ring and we didn't know who it was, and we used to go back, and now our cell phones, we usually know who it is. And if we don't know, well, I even got one the other day that was from my bank, supposedly. Until he started asking a few questions, and I'm like, this doesn't sound like my bank would actually be. It was not my bank. But they were trying to verify that I had approved this charge on the last 4 digits of this card. That's the kind of thing that's a scam. You need to make sure you're aware of it. We want you to, we try to look out for your bottom line, raise awareness on these things. These are the things that are out there right now. Whether you're getting phone calls or emails, do not click on a link in an email, period. Just don't do it. Go put it in yourself, type it in. Do not click on a link. Very dangerous. So those are the cautions I'll remind you of right now. Finally, National RIA provides a variety of services. We talked about Bill Track 50. That's, again, if you go to our site, these are things from not only the legislative side, but also adding on regulatory aspects that we're tracking, from what HUD's doing on different issues to EPA and lead and all of that. But then we can actually make action on it, which is voter voice. So we can actually reach out and move. So if you've got something going on in your state, we can help with that. We have a couple up right now that are operating, and they're based on federal level, typically. Co-sponsors for the Affordable Access Bill. Those are the kinds of things we want to make sure we're encouraging. We have these tools available for state level, for federal level. Don't overlook your veteran real estate investors. Those people who've been doing it for a while, they've probably got contacts, information. They know how to speak on these issues. They know them inside and out. Get them on your legislative committees, be involved with it, and draw in your vendors. Your vendors know a lot, whether it's title agencies, attorneys, all of that. Bring them to the table. Make sure you're have an open tent on that and cooperating, because they can provide you a lot of expertise on and heads up on bills coming forward. Local lobbyists is very important, and one of the things you'll find is actually there's a fair number of politicians and elected officials, and I'll separate those two, that are actually in our business, that have, whether they're the accidental landlord, as it were, the housing provider by accident because they moved and never sold the house or bought one next to them, or they've got a property and they understand what it means to have real estate, and they understand the headaches and the hassles, and that can be a good friend to make sure you're developing and supporting. Locally, we work with Curate Solutions, recommend them. You can use them at the local level. They have an AI process which actually goes out and tracks and searches any posted information. So in an area where I worked locally, they had 180 municipalities basically. It would go through and track all of those areas, and any municipality that posted on their websites any kind of meeting updates or council minutes, it would actually pull them and track them and look for keywords, so that you're not trying to track all of those, especially in a big area. That's a whole lot to do. So trying to provide some solutions for you there. But if you're interested, check out Curate Solutions. We're curious to see where this goes, because they were purchased by Fiscal Note, and we already have a contract with Voter Voice. So we'll see, maybe we can, if they're going to expand that or offer some other solutions. And if that comes forward, I'll be in touch with you on that as well. So I started off saying looking for good news, but understand that, and I'm going to go back to something that we said when COVID first started. As entrepreneurs, as small business owners and business leaders, we do not sit back and just, curl up in fetal position and cry. We're going to be doing things. So based on that, there's 3 of the 36 Chinese stratagems there that, what are you doing? I've used the example before, fish in troubled waters, loot a burning house. There's different ways right now to look at what's out there as options. We go, now's a good time for me to go and bring this back, or I'm going to start looking at how I can do this. Troubled times create opportunities. And, some people talk about recessions, depressions. Really, that's where, millionaires are actually made. We're not looking necessarily for home runs, but good solid hits. But keep your eyes open for that. Being nimble, that's how you're going to outmaneuver. Again, that's how small business outmaneuvers large business all the time, and being ready for it and not being bogged down with, oh, inflation's up and oh, things are going in the toilet. Well, guess what? That also means that might be some opportunities out there. So just encourage you on that and be ready, because bad news isn't necessarily always completely and only bad news. With that, thank you very much. And I have some questions that we'll follow up with folks on. If you have anything, you want to email it to me. My charles@nationalrea.org, nationalreia.org. Thanks. Look forward to hearing from you.